Yeah, welcome back to the channel, and today we focus on the human brain. We will also cover the peripheral nervous system. Right, let's talk about the brain. What is the brain? The brain is described as being the upper enlarged part of the spinal cord. That is how we're going to simply describe the brain. It is the larger part, it is the enlarged part of the spinal cord. It is found, of course, in the skull, right? Now, how is this brain protected? We need to also describe how the brain is protected. Why does the brain need to be protected? It is a very important organ in our body, right? Responsible for controlling so many things that occur within our bodies. So, of course, it needs to be protected. So, exactly how is it protected? Number one, it is said that this brain lies in a bony cranium. So, the area of the skull where the brain is located is referred to as the cranium. Now, it is very important to be able to differentiate between the cranium and the skull. This is simply because in this instance, the two words are not interchangeable. It is not acceptable to say that the brain lies in the skull. You must be specific that the part of the skull specifically responsible for protecting the brain is this part that is referred to as the cranium. Hence, we are going to say that way number one in which the brain is protected is that it lies within this bony cranium. That is way number one. Number two, it is said that it is also protected by a system of three membranes, and this system of three membranes is what we call the meninges. Now, the three membranes that are referred to the meninges are the pia mater, the arachnoid, and the dura mater, respectively. But it is not important for us to be able to list these three membranes by name. The collective name, which is the meninges, will be more than sufficient. Hence, we say it is protected by a system of three membranes that we simply refer to as the meninges. Number three, it is said that the brain is also cushioned by cerebrospinal fluid. So this simply functions to cushion the brain, and we call it cerebrospinal fluid. So all in all, the brain is protected in these three different ways. Now, let's try to look at the structure of the brain, and let's try to label each and individual part, and also try to come up with functions for these individual parts if at all possible. Now, let's start with the largest part of the brain. The largest part of the brain will include this big part right here. Now, this largest part of the brain is what is referred to as the cerebrum. It is what is referred to as the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and we are going to focus on three functions that are performed by the cerebrum. Function number one, the cerebrum is said to receive and interpret all sensations. By sensation, we are referring to things like the ability to see, the ability to hear, pain. Those are sensations. So in order for us to be able to detect those sensations, the impulses must be transmitted to this part, which is the cerebrum of the brain, so that they can be interpreted. So that is function number one. It receives and interprets all sensations. That is function number one. Number two, the very same cerebrum is said to control all higher thought processes. By higher thought processes, we are referring to things such as memory. Memory is a higher thought process, right? So the ability to store information and remember that information is controlled by this part of the brain that we refer to as the cerebrum. Number three, the cerebrum is also said to control all voluntary movements. By voluntary movements, we are referring to actions that you do on purpose. These are things that you decide to do by yourself. We call them voluntary actions. And these voluntary actions are controlled by this part of the brain that we refer to as the cerebrum. So those are the three functions of the cerebrum. But here's an important thing to note. The structure of the cerebrum is not one big mass like the circle I've drawn. It is two smaller masses that are going to be connected by a smaller part in the middle. Right. So the cerebrum is split into two parts, and we refer to these two parts individually as hemispheres. So the hemisphere that is on the left will simply refer to it as the left hemisphere, and the hemisphere on the right will simply refer to it as the right hemisphere. So together, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere will make up the cerebrum. But the two hemispheres are connected together by a part that is in the middle. And this part that is in the middle, in this diagram, it is indicated by the part that is labeled B. The part that is labeled B, we simply refer to it as the corpus callosum. We refer to the part labeled B as the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum simply functions to connect the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. So it connects the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the cerebrum. That is the function of this part that is referred to as the corpus callosum. Right. Now let's come to the part that is labeled C. The part that is labeled C is referred to as the cerebellum. Now we can note the shape of the cerebellum. This is this little mass that lies below the cerebrum. We simply refer to it as the cerebellum. It looks like a laugh, I think. So it is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is said to have a grand total of two functions. Function number one, the cerebellum coordinates all voluntary movement. It does not control. The control part is covered by the cerebrum. The function of the cerebellum is to coordinate all these voluntary movement. By coordination, we can talk about things such as walking. When you walk, you do not trip over yourself that often. That is because the movement of walking on its own is a coordinated movement, right? You do not necessarily think hard about where you are going to place the next foot when you are walking. So that is coordination, and it is controlled by this part that we refer to as the cerebellum. Function number two. The cerebellum is said to control, or rather it maintains balance, equilibrium, and muscle tone. Let's focus on the balance part. We know that there is a structure that is called the human ear. The human ear is also responsible for balance, but it maintains balance in collaboration with the cerebellum. So, if the cerebellum is said to maintain balance, it only makes sense to think if we damage the cerebellum, then balance is not going to be maintained. Why is this the case? This is simply because in order for the cerebellum to be able to maintain balance, it must send nerve impulses to muscles, to effectors, so that they can restore balance. But if the cerebellum is damaged, it tells me that no nerve impulses are going to be transmitted from the cerebellum to the effectors. As a consequence, balance is not going to be maintained in that scenario. Now, we can also talk about a similar case when we focus on the cerebrum, right? If we were to damage the cerebrum, it tells me that there is going to be a problem here with memory. And as a matter of fact, we are going to focus on a disease and a disorder that affects the cerebrum. But if we damage the cerebrum, we're going to have a problem with memory. If we damage the cerebellum, we're going to have a problem with balance. Right. Now let's come to focus on the part that is labeled D. The part that is labeled D is the medulla oblongata. It is the medulla oblongata. Now, the medulla oblongata is a very important part. Why is it so important? This is because the medulla oblongata controls all involuntary actions. By involuntary actions, we're talking about things that your body does subconsciously. You do not think about these things. They happen by themselves. They happen automatically. A good example of things that are controlled by the medulla oblongata, or of involuntary actions that are controlled by the medulla oblongata, we can talk about things such as heartbeat. You do not think about heartbeat or how you want your heart to beat. It does that on its own. That happens subconsciously. And since it is an involuntary action, it is controlled by the medulla oblongata. We can also talk about things such as digestion. These are things that we do not think about, but they occur by themselves. They occur involuntarily, and these are controlled by this part that we call the medulla oblongata. Now, it makes sense to think, if this medulla oblongata is damaged, this can be fatal. It can lead to death. Why is this the case? This is simply because if we damage the medulla oblongata, no nerve impulses are going to be transmitted from the medulla oblongata to the heart. Therefore, the heart will not be able to beat. And if the heart does not beat, that is going to result in death. Right? So the medulla oblongata is very important because it is going to control these involuntary actions. If it is damaged, it can be fatal. It can result in death. Now, this is what is referred to as the medulla oblongata. Now, below the medulla oblongata, we've got the part labeled E. The part labeled E here will be the spinal cord. Now, we've already focused on the spinal cord when we were discussing reflex acts and reflex actions, so we're not going to focus much on the spinal cord. But there is a very important thing to note. Between the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata, how do we differentiate them structurally when they are set in a question paper? How do we differentiate between the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata? Well, the spinal cord is usually thinner when we compare it to the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata will always look to be thicker or bigger than the spinal cord. That is how we can note differences between the two individual parts. We simply look at the sizes. Let's come to part F and G. Now, part F and G are endocrine glands. As such, we're going to focus more on them when we discuss endocrine systems and homeostasis. But the part labeled F is what is referred to as the pituitary gland. It is the pituitary gland. We'll discuss the hormones that are secreted by the pituitary gland when we focus on endocrine systems and homeostasis. But we've already focused on the pituitary gland during term 1. This is where we discussed hormones such as LH, which is the luteinizing hormone, FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. Those are pituitary hormones because they are secreted by the pituitary gland. Right. Now let's come to the part labeled G. The part labeled G is the hypothalamus. It is the hypothalamus. It is the hypothalamus. So we will discuss in details the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland when we focus on endocrine systems and homeostasis. So in general, these are the different parts of the brain, and we've already discussed their functions. Now, what is written in this slide is exactly what I was explaining in the previous slide. So we're going to simply jump over this slide. Now, we already talked about the medulla oblongata, but let's focus on this one, where we discuss the diseases and disorders of the brain. Now, we have to focus on a disorder that is referred to as being the Alzheimer's disease. Now, Alzheimer's disease results from the degeneration of brain tissue. So tissues in the brain will start to degenerate. When the tissues of the brain degenerate, they're going to result in this disease, in this disorder that is referred to as Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease is going to result in memory loss. So the way we recognize the way we see that this person is suffering from Alzheimer's disease is that a telltale sign of Alzheimer's disease is memory loss, and it is caused by the degeneration of brain tissue. Hence, it is going to result in Alzheimer's disease, right? There's not really much to explain here. So it results in memory loss. Now, we have already focused on the central nervous system, and we know that the central nervous system only has two parts, which is the brain and also the spinal cord. But now let's try to look at the peripheral nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system is said to be made of spinal and cranial nerves. But the very same peripheral nervous system can be divided into two different types of nervous systems. So the peripheral nervous system can be divided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now, the somatic nervous system deals with voluntary actions. These are things that you do on purpose. But with the autonomic nervous system, it deals with involuntary actions. These are things you do not do on purpose. Things like peristalsis, things like digestion. So those are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We can also include the heartbeat because that is an involuntary action. So it forms part and parcel of the autonomic nervous system. But this autonomic nervous system is said to be made of sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. Now, these are nerves that are said to function antagonistically to each other. This is to say, the sympathetic nerves and parasympathetic nerves of the autonomic nervous system, they function opposite to each other. The function of the sympathetic nerves is that they functions to bring a response. But the parasympathetic nerve simply function to inhibit a response. So for example, if you are running and the heart rate increases, that is part and parcel of what is controlled by the sympathetic nerves. But when you rest and the heartbeat decreases, that is part and parcel of what is controlled by the parasympathetic nerves. Hence, we say that they function opposite to each other. The sympathetic nerves will increase the heartbeat, but the parasympathetic nerves will decrease the heartbeat. Hence, we say the sympathetic nerve functions to bring about a response, but the parasympathetic nerves functions to inhibit a response. Right? So this is how we explain the structure and the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. Now, what I was discussing on that previous slide is exactly what is written here. But this is the structure that you have to follow to answer a question requiring you to describe the structure and the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. You are simply going to state that it has got sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. We know that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerves function antagonistically. If you do not want to use the word antagonistically, you can use the word opposite. So they function opposite to each other. Exactly how do they function opposite to each other? The sympathetic nerves bring a response, but the parasympathetic nerves inhibit a response. Now, this was a very short video. If you like what we've had to say, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Until next time, bye-bye.